Hi everyone, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, October 12th. And last class we viewed Cat People, which I wanted to talk a little bit more about, a film from the 1940s that I really think does illustrate some of the fears and anxieties of that particular decade. And as we can see, the films are becoming much more sophisticated in relation to what we started with, which was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, viewed as the first horror film ever created, a silent film. So that in and of itself was a different kind of viewing experience. However, the symbolism of the film about sanity and insanity and the horrors of the real world and how do we differentiate them from fictional horrors, I think very much is important in terms of our understanding the genre of horror film. Sanity and insanity and the misperceptions or the possible misperceptions of reality are common themes that we will see throughout these films, and also are common themes, I think, that provoke anxiety from generation to generation. And then we moved to Dracula, very iconic horror film. And this would be a talkie, so it would be different. Dracula viewed as the first American horror film. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being a German film, so oftentimes viewed as a commentary from the German populace. But I think that Dracula is very much firmly embedded in the American ethos, especially if we were to view Dracula symbolically as invading foreigner who is corrupting basically innocent female and corrupting the bloodlines of the British populace. That said, there are lots of other ways to read Dracula. Obviously, Dracula, filmed in the 1930s, would have been very much a reflection of some of the economic turmoil of the time, the Great Depression. The idea that Dracula could serve as a symbol for greedy capitalists who's living off of the lifeblood of others in order to survive, I think is quite relevant. And would have been quite relevant for an audience, though, of course, audiences in the 1930s were looking for a certain level of escapism. Note that we have the defeat of Dracula by the ending of the film, which was required by the film code of the time, that ultimately normality would be restored and evil would be destroyed. But it also gave, I would suggest, audiences a sense of hope through the economic depression, that capitalists would be put in their place and that ultimately the victor would be the populace. And then we move forward to Cat People. And I think Cat People very much illustrates some of the anxieties about gender, specifically female, that would have been evolving from the 1920s in the United States, which would have been the beginning of women's right to vote. Moving into the 1940s, where now ultimately women are being embraced into the workplace, in part because of economic and political issues of the time, as we entered into the Second World War, and ultimately women needed to enter into the workforce as men were drafted or volunteered, I should say, into the war. And then ultimately, the shifts of society when the war ended, and there needed to be a reaffirmation of previous values, and of course the backlash that would be experienced because of that. And in fact, I think I might have told you that I'm working on a book on horror film. I just wanted to share with you just a little bit of the writing that I've done in terms of Cat People. And it's not long. And what I have thus far is, while less iconic than Dracula, Jacques Tourneau's Cat People from 1942 is arguably equally relevant. Deliberately subtle, the film is ambiguous and suggestive, an example of what Stephen King calls terror. Cinematography is reminiscent of film noir, moody, atmospheric, foggy, shadowy. In terms of trivia, Cat People is credited as the first horror film to employ a jump scare in a desolate scene where a screeching buzz mimics the cry of an enraged cat. While the 1940s grappled with the horrors of World War II, it also contended with the mass sociological shift of large numbers of women replacing their male counterparts in the workplace, and the subsequent fear of the growing power of female. These fears are evidenced in the film's premise, a Serbian folktale warning against the consequences of expressed female passion, the uncontrollable bestial transformation into a vicious and predatory cat. This message about the danger of uncaging female force is particularly resonant in the 1940s, a time of rising female social and economic power. In the film's plot, the main female character, a Serbian foreigner named Irina, is frightened of consummating her marriage with her new husband, an American named Oliver, because she fears sex will lead to her bestial transformation into a cat. While sexual repression and generalized fears surrounding female sexuality still exist today, they were even more prevalent in the 1940s, evident in the movie posters that portray Irina as a sexual predator, inflicting great harm or even death upon her victims. Some queer interpretations of the film argue that Irina is in fact a lesbian, repressing her true sexuality. Regardless, the irony is that the true predator in the film is not Irina, but her psychiatrist, Dr. Louis Judd. Dr. Judd attempts to seduce Irina under the guise of curing her phobia. In addition, Irina's rival Alice encourages Oliver into entering into an emotional affair with Alice, calling herself, quote, new kind of other woman, unquote. Then Oliver rejects Irina after she is ready to become physically intimate with him. Basically, Irina is betrayed by everyone around her. Perhaps worse, Dr. Judd, Alice, and Oliver all readily agree to institutionalize the, quote, delusional, unquote, Irina when they find they cannot control her or her fears or her behavior. Superstitious lore about cats abounds. For instance, the connection between black cats and evil witches. Note that stereotypes about evil witches also result from fear of female power. However, in Egyptian times, the cat was revered in non-Christian worship. In Irina, we see the intersectionality of multiple marginalized groups: female, foreigner, and non-Christian. Oliver, in direct contrast to Irina, represents the Christian American male, a, quote, good old Americano, unquote, as Oliver calls himself. Tellingly, in one scene, Christian Oliver successfully repels transformed Irina with a T-square casting a shadow of a cross on the wall. Here, Oliver is battling ancient evil itself and invokes God himself by saying, Irina, and I have to add in that quote basically at this point. As I said, this is a draft. Irina has regressed, almost in a kind of reverse Darwinism, into the other, an evil bestial monstrosity that must and will be destroyed at the film's end, much like Dracula. The concept of other is represented in not just Serbian Irina, a foreigner clinging to old world legends, but also a black waitress serving her Caucasian diners, including Oliver. At one point, the waitress laments that none of the customers ordered gumbo, an ethnic dish associated with the foreign. Instead, Oliver orders apple pie and coffee, the quintessential American meal. In other words, normalcy resides in Caucasian America. Hence, it is no surprise then that foreigner Irina is killed at the end of the film, with Oliver and Alice left to begin their new life together as good old Americanos. So as I said, that's just a draft, and I need to expand and develop that, but it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what I've always thought about this film. Definitely, it's about female sexuality and the fears of female sexuality, but it's also about inner evil in general and the repression of inner evil. Of course, the film from a cinematic perspective, as some of you already have indicated in journals and in your discussion forum responses, quite beautiful. Lots of fogs, lots of shadows, very film noir-like. And of course, Cat People has earned its place in horror film history by offering us the first jump scare, which I didn't want to reveal to you until after you saw the film, that very famous bus scene, which actually was highlighted in the documentary we saw, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. And of course, when the bus comes to a halt, the screech is very similar to that of a cat. There's a lot of cat symbolism and a lot of cat imagery in the film, very deliberately so. So the film has quite a few literary elements associated with it. The film is also known for its subtlety and its focus on psychology, rather than showing us the gore. Instead, it's implied. Anybody who's ever spent time alone in a home and has heard a strange noise will probably acknowledge that that fear is much greater than the actual monstrosity that you might be confronting in a time of horror, because of the power of the imagination. So the swimming pool scene is also quite famous, and I believe it was also highlighted in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Of course, cats fear water. That could be perhaps a reason why Irina does not enter into the water. And for the time period, showing a woman in a bathing suit, or even if you think about some of Irina's behavior, as some of you had acknowledged, it seems that she very quickly moves into offering Oliver a invitation into her home, which could even be seen as somewhat questionable in today's world, certainly in the 1940s. Irina definitely represents that old world Serbian. She represents the other that ultimately has to be conquered by American. It's a theme that we've also seen in Dracula, and that I suggest we will also be seeing in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And this sense of reverse Darwinism, of sort of regression. If you know anything about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's definitely a story about repression and the repression of duality, which is a theme that we see in Cat People. And it also is, I think, very much this sense of a regression into ancient traits, being those associated with sin. When that bird dies of fright, and many of you had talked about the idea of animal rights in terms of this film, the bird was oftentimes seen as a symbol for female. Notice that this bird is caged, much like Oliver is perhaps trying to cage Irina. And the result is that this bird dies. And ultimately, we could see that as a kind of foreshadowing when Irina herself dies. We'll talk about birds some more when we talk about Psycho. And when we get to the 1960s, which will be soon, you'll see that I did a little bit of cheating in that I have two films that represent the 1960s. But I would argue that the 1960s is a particularly important decade, and it certainly was one that was characterized by great conflict and tension for a whole host of reasons. So from the early 1960s will be Psycho, which is considered to be the first modern horror film by Alfred Hitchcock. And then in the late 60s will be Night of the Living Dead, which not only helped to revolutionize the genre of zombie, but also featured a black male lead. So it's very important historically. And in fact, if you are interested, you might be aware of the Lava Center, which is in downtown Greenfield. They'll be holding multiple events in celebration of Halloween. The Lava Center is a kind of art center incubator. And I will be actually presenting at the Lava Center right before Halloween. That'll be the Sunday before Halloween. I'll remind you of the date next class as we get a little bit closer to Halloween. I'll be reading a section from my draft book on Night of the Living Dead. We'll also be doing a viewing of Night of the Living Dead and having a discussion afterwards. And as you know, Night of the Living Dead is a text in this class. And as you are also well aware, this class is an online class, so our discussions about Night of the Living Dead will be online. But if it turns out that you wanted to have some in-person conversation about Night of the Living Dead, then you might be interested in going to the Lava Center presentation, which again, I will give you further information about next class. The terror of intimacy, not just the terror of sexuality. Obviously, there's a very distant relationship between Oliver and Irina. Oliver has a much stronger connection with Alice. In fact, Alice even says at one point that she's the new kind of other woman. And while they aren't having a physical affair, they certainly are having an emotional affair with the way that Oliver is able to share intimate details about his life with Alice in a way that he never could with Irina. So this terror of intimacy, it does strike me, of course, that the fireplace is on fire when Irina is finally ready to consummate her relationship. Again, that oftentimes is used as an image or a symbol, fire and passion. And of course, by this point, Oliver has completely abandoned her. And as many of you indicated, that the true villains in this piece aren't Irina, but they're certainly Dr. Judd, who tries to take advantage of her. But also her own husband and also Alice as well. They so quickly leap to judgment and assume that if she can't basically accept Americanized ways and dismiss the myths of her people, and that also suggests accepts Christian ways, that she should be institutionalized. This was not that unusual, actually, in the past for a woman who didn't fit into the norm to be categorized as crazy or insane and ultimately to be institutionalized. If you know the short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper, then you'll understand that motif about the insane woman, which I think is also embedded in this particular piece. Some of the superstitious lore associated with cats, of course, the black cat as being evil, the assumption that it's Irina that's evil and not the people who are surrounding her. But cats were revered in Egypt. They were Egyptian gods. And that also suggests a religious practice that is non-Christian. And of course, embedded within these films is the idea that Christianity is savior. The fact that ultimately we've got that wonderful shadow scene where Oliver is holding up a T-square and it looks like a cross through its shadow is very deliberate. And again, he even references the Christian God when he says that basically the evil should depart them. In terms of cat symbolism, just looking for some of it in the film can be great fun. There's a clawfoot tub because ultimately the claw is associated with the cat. The museum boat head, you might have noticed, was of a cat. Irina, when she's on the sofa, she's slitting the upholstery with her nails, very cat-like behavior. Of course, those female screams that one might say not only mimic the panther screams, but perhaps could also be the screams of sexual ecstasy. And that said, there's been lots of ways to read this film from a sexual perspective, including queer readings that would suggest that the Catwoman, as she's known as, the other Serbian woman who appears during the wedding reception, she's obviously dressed very much like a cat, so she's supposed to bring forth these images, and they have this very foreboding dialogue, she and Irina. In fact, they call each other sisters. And the sense that perhaps the reason why Irina is so hesitant to consummate the relationship, and she even says at one point she wants to be like, quote, normal, unquote, women who are happy with their husbands, could be more than just about losing virginity, and it could just be about sexual orientation. If you wanted to read the film in that way. And I do deliberately use the term read because basically we're watching these films from a literary perspective. Or as I often ask you in your journals, is how can this film be illustrative of some of the fears and anxieties of its time period, which is how I've organized this course. But that's not to say there aren't other ways of analyzing these films as well. So the literary elements of the film, the quote, "But black sin hath betrayed to endless night, my world both parts, and both parts must die," is actually from John Donne. So he's a very famous poet. Again, it talks about the idea of duality, of good and evil, light and dark, sin and purity. So we'll see all of those embedded within the characters and the themes of this particular play. Not just is the T-square, Again, one of my favorite images in the play, Christian references, but you might have noticed that the table setting, it almost looks like an altar. And this is something that I suggested also with Dracula as well, and others have suggested as well, that the altar is very much set up like a Christian, or that the table setting with the Renfield / Jonathan Harker character, depending if you're reading the book or if you're watching the film. But in the film, it basically is Renfield as real estate agent. In the book, it's Jonathan Harker as real estate agent. But regardless, this idea of visiting Dracula on his home turf, so to speak, and of course, you know, that usurpation of what should be embraced as Christian savior is what the vampire is. Ultimately, Christian symbols such as cross repel it. And then, of course, in this almost mock Christian ceremony, Dracula has laid out this sort of pseudo altar for the Renfield character, even offering him wine. And of course, in Christian ceremonies, wine is used as a celebration of Christ's blood. And of course, blood is the life, as we see within the vampire mythology. And even Dracula himself, I believe, utters something to that effect. The Eurocentrism within the film, as I had suggested from the short piece that I had read to you, is very evident, I think, in that black waitress who's supposed to also represent other, much like Irina. And a scene that seems to be seemingly unimportant, where that nobody wants gumbo being representative of a kind of ethnicity and a kind of otherness. Instead, they want apple pie and coffee. And again, the idea that Oliver calls himself an Americano. Alice is also supposedly another Americano. And that they walk off together into the sunset, so to speak. Almost like we saw with Dracula, where we've got our American couple ascending the stairs. It almost looks like a Christian wedding ceremony. So some of the symbolism in the text or in the film that I wanted to point out, the brownstone. The idea behind a brownstone is what lies behind the facade of that. It's something that Jekyll and Hyde actually examines. The caged cat, the idea of the caged or the repressed emotions that are being examined in the film, and urges as well, instinctual oftentimes. The idea that the key, that this film is going to try to unlock some of the psychological issues of id, ego, and superego, which I think fit very nicely into this film. That id is our base, uncontrolled desires. The ego is the piece of our personality that tries to have some balance between the unregulated id and the conscience of the superego. So if you wanted to read this film from a psychological perspective, particularly if you happen to be taking a psychology class, you've probably talked a little bit about Sigmund Freud. Talking about Freud, there is some phallic symbolism in this film as well. So certainly swords have oftentimes been seen as a phallic image, especially when they're used to penetrate. So that said, there's a reference to John Paul Jones, which happens to be the name of the cat that's adopted by Oliver's workplace. And John Paul Jones is a famous historical figure, a famous American historical figure. I think that's very important. He was an American naval commander who defeated the British. You might have heard his very famous phrase, "I have not yet begun to fight." But if the film really is about the superiority of American, then I think that also is embedded in the idea of naming the cat John Paul Jones. He was a very famous American warrior. So some of the themes in the film, this idea of darkness versus light, which I think the cinematography shows so lovely, so in such a lovely way. Evil versus good. That's something that we've seen in Dracula and also the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. sexuality versus chastity. And the interesting way that women would have been viewed at the time, the whore or the Madonna complex, either they were sexually pure and they were undamaged goods, or they were corrupted and they were viewed as whore. And of course, this was something that could not be maintained through marriage. So there's some contradiction here. This idea goes all the way back to the English Renaissance. It's something that Shakespeare himself would have referenced within his own plays. And the seeming contradiction of the two. How do you remain virginal, but also fulfill your duty as wife and ultimately mother? And the assumption is that you are basically supposed to birth children. And of course, when we see Irina, with the subtext that's listed or that's implied here is that Irina's a career woman. She's an artist. And if she doesn't consummate her relationship, she's not going to get pregnant, which means she's not going to fulfill her role as mother. And that also suggests, too, that perhaps she's looking for something more in a marriage that's just wife and mother. And that, too, would have been hugely controversial for the 1940s, especially a time period where women were able to enter the workforce and get a taste of some economic independence, and then the attempt to withdraw that from females so that they could return to the homestead. This idea of folktale, which is what Irina's story is, oftentimes, and I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier classes about Cat People, is that we had Hollywood directors that were oftentimes visiting the folk tales of the past, but putting modern twists on them. Whether it happens to be about this old mystic Caligari that was created for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Of course, in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, we have this circular story where story is embedded within story, and we have an untrustworthy narrator. It's a technique that's also used in Citizen Kane, by the way, if you're familiar with that film. Very famous film from a film historical perspective. And certainly the idea of the vampire has existed in folk tales in just about every culture. But now we have a deliberate reference to this Serbian folk tale, again, Serbia representing other. So those are just some of the ways that you could examine Cat People. In terms of thinking about final projects, which I had mentioned last class, I had talked about some of the conventions of writing, and I had uploaded some information onto our syllabus and other course documents website. You'll also see that in today's notes below this video, I have some examples of quotation, because you might be, or at least some references to quotation, because you might be quoting. Now, if you're quoting from a film, usually what we do is we indicate a timestamp rather than a page number. We use page number in parentheses immediately following a quote if we are quoting from a book. And that said, the idea behind this system, the MLA or Modern Language Association system, is to try to be as simple as possible, to provide the reader with the least amount of information so they could verify where your quote is coming from. And if you're utilizing paraphrase, putting it in your own words, you don't necessarily need parenthetical documentation. But if you are using a direct quote from a text or from a film, you definitely have to use parenthetical documentation. So if it turns out that that's the kind of thing that you would be doing with the project, and keep in mind that I encouraged you to think about some more creative approaches where I've had individuals do things like create their own short horror films, though they've also included some commentary about what they did and why they did it and how that fits into some of the themes of the class. Or create their own video game. And again, they also include commentary with that. So in the commentary, it might turn out that you are using some quotation, which just depends on how you're structuring your paper. But the convention is that if you're using a direct quote, and you can decide where to begin and end your quote, so it doesn't have to be at the beginning or the ending of a sentence. You can start mid-sentence, I should say, with your quote. Then immediately following the quote, you include a parentheses. And within those parentheses, you include something like a timestamp if you are referencing something from a film, or you are including something like a page number. And that's it. Then we close our parentheses, and then we either put our ending punctuation, or we end up continuing on with our sentence, and then we can ultimately end with the punctuation for that sentence. So I'm hopeful that this is basically review. One of the reasons why English 101 is one of the prerequisites for this class. But do note that I have suggested some websites, and the GCC library is terrific in this respect because they actually have a link on the website itself about how to document and how to write papers in the event that you decided to write a paper. But I also wanted to indicate some of the conventions with quoting that you could utilize. If you've ever seen a square bracket in a quote, then I'm hopeful that you know that that means that that's an insertion. That was not part of the original quote, that this was something that the writer inserted, usually to clarify information. If something would seem to be, let's say, unclear, let's say a pronoun usage based on the quote that you actually selected. A pronoun might be used, he, let's say, and it's unclear which character you're talking about, whether it be Dracula or whether it be Renfield. In this instance, what you could do is within that quote, immediately after the word he is clarified by using a square brackets and adding in the name Dracula. So then it's very clear that you're talking about Dracula and you're not talking about Renfield. Then you close your square brackets and you continue on with your quote. You wouldn't add any additional commentary. You can comment on the quote immediately before or after the quote. So that's not the point of the square bracket. The square bracket is almost like interrupting somebody when they're speaking, that there's a need for you to intervene. And you can also leave out part of a quote, and you've perhaps seen this within a quote, what is known as an ellipsis, or what are basically 3 periods or 3 dots. And what that piece of punctuation indicates is that you left out a word or multiple words from the quote. And that said, you're not leaving out words to change the meaning. You're leaving out words just because they aren't necessary. You don't need to begin or end a quote with this ellipsis because you get to decide where to begin it and where to end it. So you get to decide the start and stop point. But between the start and the stop point, if you were going to leave out some information, a word or several words, not because it changes the meaning of the quote again, but purely because ultimately it's just not necessary, then you would use an ellipsis. And if you have a long quote, which is basically usually identified as a quote that's over 3 lines of typed text, you would block it off. You would indent it so that ultimately it would be very clear to the reader where the quote begins and, more importantly, where the quote ends. Usually with a quote, when we see a quote mark, we assume that the closing quote marks are coming soon. And that wouldn't necessarily be the case with a quote that's over 3 lines long. So you indent it so that it stands out much like a block. And you don't use quotation marks because it would be considered redundant. When you're using a quotation mark within the body of your paper, you're letting the reader know, hey, I'm quoting. But by blocking off your quote, you're letting the reader know, hey, I'm quoting. So again, I realized that this was rather hurried. I direct you to some of the information that I've uploaded onto syllabus and other documents folder. I direct you to the GCC library website. I also direct you to Purdue OWL, which is a website from Purdue University that talks about the entire writing process, from generating ideas to actually handing in a final copy and everything in between. And the beauty of that site is that you don't have to be a Purdue student to access it. They made it available to the general public. How nice is that? So, as you begin to think about your final project, and I hope you're beginning to think now, and we will continue to discuss the final project as the semester progresses, wanted to move to the 1950s, specifically Invasion of the Body Snatchers is the film that I chose to represent the 1950s. Though I know that in one of your textbooks, they had also talked about The Thing, but I think Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a much more symbolic film. It's based on a science fiction novel, actually, by Jack Finney, called The Body Snatchers. And you'll see in watching the film, if you haven't already seen it, because my suspicion is as we get to more contemporary films, you're going to be more and more familiar with the films. Very much in a film noir style with lots of shadows again, beautifully filmed. And in 1994, the film was added into the Library of Congress and the National Film Registry as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant, something that we had talked about with Dracula as well, though it took quite a while for this 1950s film to be added into the 1990s. And again, I don't want to give away too much about the film in the event that you haven't seen it, but it's oftentimes seen as a commentary about communism. This is a film about invading space aliens, and this could be viewed as a film about invading communists into the United States. That said, if you're familiar with your history, in 1948 there was a newspaper article about a supposed flying saucer that had crashed in Roswell, New Mexico. And that also led to speculation about literal space aliens, particularly in regards to some of the scientific discoveries and advances that were being made at the time. Keep in mind that some of the 1950s advances included the atom bomb, which could mean the destruction of society as we know it. So there was the sense of apocalyptic possibility in the 1950s, the ending of the world. It was also the beginning of the early Cold War between America and or democracy and communism, America and Russia. As much as things change, they remain the same because we have similar kinds of tensions perhaps going on now. And what could this mean with the possible World War III and with the atom bomb? Would this be the annihilation of society? Of course, this idea of fear of invasion and immigration, which is something that I've been talking about with several of these films. The 1950s in particular, I think, presented very much this sense of suburbia being a safe refuge. And definitely there was this sense that a suburbia couldn't be infiltrated, for lack of a better word, by foreigner. We get the exact opposite in this particular film, so you should look out for that as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This was a time known as White Flight that you might have heard of, where many cities were being abandoned by former Caucasian residents to set up locales in the suburbs as a place of refuge, and that was the last thing that they found, not only in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but in films such as Psycho as well, that we will be talking about. This was also a time about the importance of the television, and people were spending more and more time secluded within their homes, and oftentimes it was discussed that television was taking away individual ability to think and to analyze. And in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, we are going to be seeing this sense of these mindless masses who are unable to think. Again, something that will be picked up in films such as Night of the Living Dead for the 1960s. And the way that individuals are transformed in this film is by falling asleep. And do think about the idea of falling asleep is not only not paying attention, but think about how important sleep was with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari when we were talking about Caesar. So as you can see, I've included some notes below if you wanted some spoilers about this idea of Invasion of the Body Snatchers that we will be examining in further depth. I wanted to talk about things like the portrayal of female in this film and just general dehumanization. But in terms of the film, luckily, I was able to find a website. Please excuse that phone. I'm recording live, so that's one of the difficulties with recording live. And since I'm almost done, I'm not going to re-record in this particular instance. But that said, I'm going to leave you with your discussion forum question, and also with the good news that I was able to find a free link for Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But if you ever find links for some of these films that are better links than what I found, and they're free links online, for instance, links that closed captioning, please, please, please let me know and let your classmates know. But at least at this point, I was able to find the link for Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I've just tested it and it works. As we get into more contemporary films, that's going to be increasingly difficult. The attendance question that I'm going to ask you to answer by Saturday on October 14th is, what do you think is the main message in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and why? After you're done watching the film, what do you think is the main message, or at least one of the main messages in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and why? And of course, if you need an extension, please ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. And also on Saturday would be your journal that would be due for Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And again, if you want an extension, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant it to you if you'd prefer to have a little bit more class commentary before you actually write your journal. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates' responses on the discussion forum, only if you're moved to do so, much like as if we were in a live class, if you wanted to add something in a class discussion. But you are required to read your classmates' discussion forum responses and my responses in turn. As you can see, I'm responding to all of you. So that would give you a sense of the kinds of class discussion that we would have if we were meeting face-to-face. So that said, the schedule for next semester should be coming out soon. It has not been finalized, but thus far in the draft schedule, this class will be offered in a face-to-face format. That's what we've been trying to do at GCC, is offer an online version and a face-to-face version. So more information will be upcoming in the next few weeks, but right now it appears like that'll be the case. If you happen to know anybody who would like to take this class in a face-to-face format. Or if you are a true horror aficionado and you would like to have the face-to-face experience in addition to the online experience. But at any rate, I am eager to read what you think some of the messages are of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I'm well. I hope you're doing well, and we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.